As the 1920s drew to a close, the United States stood at the height of global power and optimism. The post-World War I economy had boomed, cities had grown, industries had flourished, and new technologies had reshaped American life. However, beneath this surface of prosperity lay deep economic imbalances, rising inequality, speculative bubbles in the stock market, and unchecked banking practices. On October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed, and the country plunged into the worst economic downturn in its history, the Great Depression. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, panic spread quickly. Millions of Americans watched their savings vanish overnight. Banks failed en masse, businesses closed their doors, and the unemployment rate soared to unprecedented levels. By 1933, over 25% of the workforce was unemployed. People stood in red lines, lived in shanty towns derisively called Hoovervilles, and faced a future that seemed increasingly hopeless. The agricultural sector was devastated as well, especially in the Great Plains, where a combination of drought and poor farming practices led to the Dust Bowl massive dust storms that destroyed farmland and displaced thousands of families, many of whom fled west to California in search of work and survival. President Herbert Hoover, who was in office at the onset of the crisis, maintained a belief in limited government intervention. He urged volunteerism and private charity as solutions, but these measures were woefully inadequate in the face of such massive economic collapse. The public's frustration with his perceived inaction paved the way for a dramatic political shift in the 1932 election, when Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the presidency in a landslide. FDR entered office with a promise of a New Deal for the American people, a bold series of federal programs, reforms, and public works, initiatives aimed at restoring confidence, creating jobs, and reforming the economic system to prevent future crises. The New Deal was not a single piece of legislation, but rather a collection of efforts rolled out in phases. During his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt pushed through sweeping legislation, including the Emergency Banking Act, which stabilized the banking system, and the establishment of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guaranteed bank deposits. Roosevelt's fireside chats radio, broadcasts where he spoke directly to the American people, helped reassure the public and reframe the relationship between citizens and their government. Agencies like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, and the Works Progress Administration created millions of jobs, building roads, schools, bridges, and parks. Artists, writers, and musicians were also employed to contribute to the cultural enrichment of society. The New Deal also introduced critical reforms to the financial sector. The Securities and Exchange Commission was established to regulate the stock market and prevent abuses, while the Social Security Act of 1935 created a safety net for the elderly, unemployed, and disabled, transforming the federal government's role in ensuring social welfare. However, the New Deal faced opposition. Conservatives argued it expanded federal power too much and stifled business. The Supreme Court initially struck down several New Deal programs as unconstitutional. In response, Roosevelt proposed a controversial court-packing plan that would have allowed him to appoint additional justices more favorable to his policies. Though the plan failed, the court eventually began to uphold New Deal laws, and Roosevelt's influence reshaped the judiciary for a generation. Despite these reforms, the Depression did not fully end with the New Deal. Unemployment remained high through the 1930s, and economic growth was slow. It would take another global crisis, World War II, to pull the United States fully out of economic despair. In Europe and Asia, during the late 1930s, fascist regimes began expanding aggressively. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany violated the Treaty of Versailles and began annexing territory. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia, while militaristic Japan expanded into China and Southeast Asia. As totalitarian powers rose, The U.S. initially maintained a policy of isolationism, passing neutrality acts to avoid entanglement in another foreign war. But events overseas soon made isolationism increasingly untenable. The outbreak of World War II began in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war. The U.S. remained officially neutral, but began aiding the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease, which supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, and other nations with vital war materials. Meanwhile, tensions with Japan escalated in the Pacific due to Japanese expansion and U.S. embargoes on critical supplies like oil. Everything changed on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, and much of the Pacific Fleet was damaged or destroyed. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan, and soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The U.S. was now fully engaged in World War II. Mobilization was swift and massive. Factories across the country were converted to produce tanks, airplanes, and ammunition. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, while African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans also contributed significantly, despite facing discrimination. The economy roared back to life with full employment and increased industrial output. The government issued war bonds and rationed materials to support the war effort. On the home front, however, not all policies were just. In a moment of fear and prejudice, the U.S. government ordered the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were citizens, forcing them into remote camps under suspicion of disloyalty. This action, later widely condemned, highlighted the tension between civil liberties and national security during times of crisis. The war in Europe turned in the Allies' favor by 1943. After brutal fighting in North Africa and Italy, the Allies launched the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, storming the beaches of Normandy, France. This massive operation opened a Western front against Nazi Germany. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union pushed from the east after breaking the Nazi siege of Stalingrad and reclaiming vast territories. By April 1945, Allied forces were closing in on Berlin. Hitler committed suicide, and Germany surrendered on May 8th, known as VE Day. The war in the Pacific, however, raged on. Fierce battles were fought on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Japanese military showed little sign of surrendering, even as their losses mounted and American bombers destroyed major cities. Facing the prospect of a prolonged and bloody invasion of Japan, President Harry S. Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt after his death in April 1945, made a fateful decision. In August 1945, the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The unprecedented destruction and loss of life shocked the world. Japan surrendered shortly after, on August 15, 1945, marking VJ Day and the end of World War II. The war had transformed the United States. Over 400,000 Americans lost their lives, but the country emerged stronger than ever economically, militarily, and politically. The U.S. had become a superpower and a central architect of the post-war world. Institutions like the United Nations were established to prevent future global conflict, and the foundations were laid for a new global order dominated by 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. World War II had also reshaped American society. Women and minorities had taken on new roles. The federal government had expanded in size and scope, and the economy had reached new heights. But it also exposed deep contradictions, racism, inequality, and the limits of liberty that would come to the forefront in the decades ahead. As the U.S. moved into the second half of the 20th century, it would face new challenges in a rapidly changing world.